The evening sun cast long shadows across Maxwell Thornton's luxurious hospital suite as monitors beeped steadily beside his bed. The room was silent except for the gentle hum of medical equipment and the occasional footsteps of nurses passing in the hallway. At 58, Max had never imagined himself here, lying motionless beneath crisp white sheets in the city's most expensive private medical facility. It had started with a headache, just a splitting pain behind his eyes during a board meeting. Then came the dizziness, the slurred speech, and finally darkness. The doctors called it a minor stroke, but there was nothing minor about waking up unable to move or speak while people discussed your condition as if you weren't there. Mr. Thornton shows minimal brain activity, a young doctor had said earlier that day, flipping through charts at the foot of his bed. He may hear us, but there's no indication he comprehends or can respond. That was when Max made the discovery. While trying desperately to signal that he understood every word, his pinky finger had twitched. Not much, just a slight movement, but it was voluntary. He'd tried again, focusing all his energy, and achieved the same result. His body wasn't completely beyond his control after all. But instead of celebrating this breakthrough, a strange thought occurred to Max. What if he didn't tell anyone? What if he just listened? For 30 years, Maxwell Thornton had been surrounded by people who agreed with everything he said, laughed at his jokes, whether they were funny or not, and treated his every passing thought like gospel. As the owner of Thornton Real Estate Development, he'd built half the city's skyline and amassed a fortune that afforded him both luxury and isolation. People feared him, respected him, envied him, but did anyone actually care about him? His decision was made when his wife Patricia swept into the room that afternoon, designer heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. She barely glanced at him before addressing the doctor. How much longer will this continue? There are decisions that need to be made, contracts that require signatures, she said, her voice tight with irritation rather than concern. Mrs. Thornton, your husband's condition is stable but unchanged. We're still running tests to determine the extent of the damage, the doctor explained patiently. Patricia sighed and finally approached the bed, her expensive perfume filling his nostrils as she leaned over. Max, this is incredibly inconvenient timing, she whispered. The Parker deal is hanging by a thread, and the board is getting nervous. I need you to snap out of this. Max felt a chill that had nothing to do with his condition. 32 years of marriage, and this was her response to him lying helpless in a hospital bed. No tears, no tenderness, just frustration at the business interruption. He'd known their relationship had cooled over the years, but this cold calculation shocked even him. She stayed only 15 minutes before making an excuse about an important meeting. As she gathered her things, her phone rang. Yes, I'm just leaving the hospital now, she said, lowering her voice, but not enough. No change. The doctors aren't sure if he'll recover. I know, but we need to be patient. Everything needs to look proper. We'll talk later. The conversation sent Max's thoughts racing. Who was she speaking to with such intimacy about his condition? What needed to look proper? The questions multiplied as the door closed behind her. Later that evening, his son Thomas arrived. At 30, Thomas was the son Max had never understood. Artistic, thoughtful, and completely uninterested in the family business. Their relationship had fractured years ago when Thomas chose art school over business college. A decision Max had called throwing your life away on finger painting. They hadn't spoken in nearly 3 years. Thomas stood awkwardly at the doorway before finally entering. Unlike Patricia, he approached the bed immediately, pulling up a chair and sitting in silence for several minutes. Hey, Dad, he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. The doctors say you probably can't hear me, but I don't know, maybe some part of you can. He paused, fidgeting with the sleeve of his jacket. I'm sorry it took something like this to bring me here. I've been meaning to call to try and fix things between us, but pride gets in the way, you know? Max felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with his medical condition. He'd never heard his son speak so openly before. I brought you something, Thomas continued, pulling out a small framed photo. Remember this fishing trip when I was 10? Before all the fighting and disappointment? Before you became too busy for family weekends? It was the last time I remember us both being happy together. He placed the photo on the bedside table, angling it so it would be visible from the bed. The nurse said familiar items might help even in a coma. I don't know if that's true, but I thought maybe it could remind you of something worth coming back for. Max wanted desperately to reach out, To tell his son he remembered that weekend perfectly, the sunrise over the lake, Thomas's excitement at catching his first base, the simple pleasure of conversation without arguments, but his body remained still, his voice silent. After Thomas left, a parade of business associates came through. His executive assistant bringing paperwork for Patricia to sign, his partner Richard discussing contingency plans as if Max were already dead, and 2 board members clearly more interested in who would take control than in his recovery. If he doesn't pull through, we need to be prepared, he overheard Richard telling Patricia in the hallway. There's too much at stake to leave things to chance. I'm handling it, Patricia had replied tersely. Just keep everyone calm until we know more. By evening, Max's mind was reeling from everything he'd learned. The people he trusted were circling like vultures. His wife was conspiring with someone, and the only genuine concern had come from the son he'd pushed away. The pretense of unconsciousness had revealed more truth in one day than he'd learned in years of running his company. As night fell and the hospital quieted, Max found himself alone with his thoughts. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, marking time in a life suddenly thrown into question. What kind of legacy had he built? A successful business, yes, but at what cost? A marriage of convenience, a estranged son, colleagues waiting for his demise. Was this all that remained of his life's work? His thoughts were interrupted by the door opening quietly. Expecting another doctor or perhaps the night nurse, Max was surprised when an unfamiliar voice filled the room. Good evening, Mr. Thornton. I'm Elena, your night nurse for the next few weeks. Her footsteps were light as she moved around the room, checking equipment with quiet efficiency. Unlike the day staff who spoke over him or the visitors who came with agendas, Elena addressed him directly as if there was no question he could hear her. Your vitals are looking stable tonight, which is good news, she said, adjusting something above his bed. I'm going to check your IV now, then make you a bit more comfortable for the night. Max felt gentle hands repositioning his arms, smoothing the sheets, and adjusting his pillow with care he hadn't experienced from anyone else all day. There we go, Elena said. The overnight shift can get lonely, so I hope you don't mind if I talk while I work. Some studies suggest coma patients can hear conversations, and even if they're not proven, I believe it helps to have a friendly voice. As she moved methodically around the room, Elena spoke about small things. The unusually warm spring weather, the flowering trees visible from his window, a book she was reading. Her voice was warm and natural, with no trace of the artificial cheerfulness or somber pity he'd heard from others. You know, Mr. Thornton, this hospital wing wouldn't exist without your donation 5 years ago, she said while checking his chart. My mother was treated here last year for heart problems. The care she received was excellent, and I've always wanted to thank the person responsible. Funny how life works sometimes, isn't it? Max felt something shift inside him, a strange mix of pride and shame. He remembered the donation vaguely, a tax write-off suggested by his accountant, nothing more. He hadn't attended the opening or given it much thought since. Yet here was this woman, genuinely grateful for something he'd done without real purpose. I'll be here all night if you need anything, Elena said, dimming the lights. Sometimes I think nighttime is when the real healing happens, when all the visitors and doctors are gone and the mind can finally rest. As Elena settled at her station outside his door, Max realized he was more awake than he'd been all day. The charade had begun as a way to learn what people truly thought of him, but it was already becoming something more, a window into a world he'd been too busy to notice, too powerful to experience honestly. Tomorrow would bring more visitors, more revelations, more pieces of a life he was seeing clearly for the first time. For now, though, he would rest and listen to the quiet movements of a nurse who treated him with more humanity than those who had known him for decades. In the darkness of his hospital room, Maxwell Thornton made a decision. He would continue this deception until he understood what his life had truly become, and perhaps what it could still be. The rhythm of hospital life soon became familiar to Max as days stretched into weeks. His private room, despite its luxury furnishings and panoramic city view, felt more like a theater where people performed versions of themselves. Everyone except Elena, whose nighttime presence had become the one thing he looked forward to. During daylight hours, doctors came and went. They spoke in clinical terms about his minimal improvement and persistent vegetative state. His business partner Richard visited almost daily, each time spending more time on phone calls in the corner of the room than actually acknowledging Max's presence. "We'll need to postpone the River District project," Richard told someone during one such call. His voice lowered but still audible. "With Thornton out of commission, the investors are getting nervous." "No, don't tell them that. Say we're conducting additional environmental studies." Max's mind raced at this information. The River District was their largest development project, fully funded and ready to break ground. What environmental studies was Richard inventing? And why would his temporary absence affect a project that had already cleared every regulatory hurdle? Patricia's visits became shorter and more perfunctory. She would arrive precisely at noon, check with the doctors, make several calls, and leave within 30 minutes. Sometimes she brought paperwork which she would spread across the small table by the window. "The power of attorney is working smoothly," she told Richard during one such visit. "The board isn't happy, but they can't do anything about it. We just need to keep this status quo for another month." Another month for what? Max wondered. The more he heard, the more he suspected that his condition was somehow advantageous to both his wife and business partner. But it was his son Thomas who surprised him most. After that first emotional visit, Thomas began coming regularly, usually in the late afternoons. Unlike the others, he would pull a chair close to the bed and simply talk, really talk, as if making up for years of strained silence. "I've been thinking a lot about why we grew so far apart," Thomas said one rainy afternoon. "I was so angry that you couldn't accept my choices. But now I wonder if I ever really tried to understand yours. You built something incredible from nothing. I just couldn't see it because I was so determined to find my own path." Thomas brought in sketches sometimes, propping them up where Max could see them if he were awake. "I finally got that teaching job at the Arts Center," he said proudly. "These are some of my students' works. Kids from tough neighborhoods finding their voice through art. It doesn't make millions like your buildings, but it matters. Dad, I think maybe that's what we both wanted all along, to build something that matters." Each revelation, each unguarded moment felt like pieces of a puzzle Max hadn't known he was meant to solve. But it was during the night shifts, when the hospital quieted and Elena arrived, that Max felt most alive despite his forced stillness. Elena Mendez. He'd learned her full name from the doctors. Conversations approached her work with a gentleness that stood out in the clinical environment. She had a routine, first checking his vitals, then adjusting his position to prevent bed sores, finally settling in for what she called their night talks. "Good evening. Mr. Thornton," she would say, her voice warm like honey and tea. "It's Thursday night, just past 11. There's a half moon out your window and the city looks peaceful from up here." She told him about her life in small, everyday details that painted a fuller picture with each passing night. Her 6-year-old daughter Lily, who was missing her front teeth and loved dinosaurs. Her mother, who had moved in with them after her heart surgery. The nursing program she attended during the day while her mother watched Lily. "4 more months until I finish my advanced certification," she said one night while changing his IV bag. "It hasn't been easy working nights and studying days, but it'll mean a better position, better pay. Lily deserves a stable home, you know, not the tiny apartment we keep having to move from whenever the rent goes up." Unlike others who visited him, Elena asked for nothing, expected nothing. She simply shared her life and cared for him with dignity. Sometimes she would read to him, not just medical charts but actual books. She had discovered a worn paperback of sea adventures in his personal belongings. The bookplate says, "To Max on his 12th birthday." "Was this a favorite of yours?" she asked, running her fingers over the faded cover. "My daughter loves stories about explorers too. I think brave hearts recognize each other across generations." That night she read him a chapter about a storm at sea, her voice rising and falling with the waves in the story. Max found himself transported back to his childhood bedroom, where that same book had been an escape from his family's financial struggles and his father's disapproval. How had he forgotten that boy who dreamed of adventure? When had success replaced wonder? Max felt tears forming behind his closed eyelids, grateful that his condition concealed this moment of vulnerability. Some nights when the ward was especially quiet, Elena would bring her study materials to his room. "Hope you don't mind if I review my notes here," she'd say, settling into the chair with textbooks. "The nurse's station gets busy, and honestly, it's peaceful in here with you." She would sometimes think aloud as she studied, working through complex medical concepts as if explaining them to him. "The human heart is amazing," she mused one night. It can be physically damaged but keep beating. It can break emotionally and still heal. It's both fragile and incredibly resilient. Kind of like people themselves, don't you think? On particularly difficult nights, when she received concerning calls about her daughter's nightmares or her mother's health, Elena would sit closer to his bed, her voice lower and more vulnerable. "I shouldn't be burdening you with my problems," she said once, after a call that left her wiping away tears. "But somehow it helps to talk to you. Maybe because you're a good listener." She laughed softly at her own joke. "Or maybe because sometimes we need to say things out loud to people who won't judge us for them." As weeks passed, Max learned that Elena worked multiple shifts to make ends meet, that she made Lily's Halloween costume by hand because store-bought ones were too expensive, that she kept a small container garden on her apartment balcony where she grew herbs and tomatoes. "Lily calls them our tiny farm," she said while adjusting his blankets one chilly evening. "It's not much, but there's something hopeful about growing things, about nurturing something and watching it thrive despite limited space and resources." Max found himself wondering what Elena would think of his expansive but neglected garden at home, tended by hired landscapers who followed strict aesthetic guidelines, but showed no real care for the plants themselves. 3 weeks into his silent observation, Max experienced a night that changed everything. Elena arrived for her shift looking unusually tired, dark circles prominent under her eyes. "Rough day, Mr. Thornton," she said, managing a small smile as she checked his monitors.
"Had an exam this morning. Then Lily got sent home sick from school.
"And my mother's heart medication needed to be refilled, but the insurance company gave us trouble again." She sighed, shoulders slumping as she sat in her usual chair. "But we don't need to focus on that. Let me tell you about this interesting article I read on coma recovery instead." The night progressed normally until around 2 in the morning, when Elena's phone rang. Her face paled as she answered it, and she stepped just outside the door to talk. Through the narrow opening, Max could hear her voice rising in distress. "What do you mean they're raising the rent again? We just signed a new lease 3 months ago." Her voice shook with a mixture of anger and fear. "That's almost 40% more. There's no way we can afford that. It has to be illegal." When she returned to the room, Elena was visibly shaken. She moved mechanically through her duties, checking his IV line twice without seeming to notice. Then, unexpectedly, she sank into the chair beside his bed and buried her face in her hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered after a long moment, wiping her eyes. "I shouldn't bring my problems to work. It's just, sometimes it feels like no matter how hard I try, there's always something pushing us back down." The quiet beeping of monitors filled the silence as Elena composed herself. "You know what's ironic, Mr. Thornton? My landlord just sold our building to a development company that's renovating, to justify doubling the rents. Everyone in our building is scrambling to find new places. Single moms, elderly couples, people who've lived there for decades." She stood and adjusted his blanket, though it didn't need adjusting. "The company that bought it? Thornton Enterprises, one of your subsidiaries." Her voice held no accusation, just a weary resignation. "I don't blame you personally. You probably don't even know about these properties. They're just numbers on spreadsheets to companies like yours." Max felt as if all the air had been sucked from his lungs. He knew exactly which property she meant. A block of older apartments his company had acquired 6 months ago as part of a larger portfolio purchase. He remembered approving the value enhancement strategy without asking questions about who lived there or where they would go. Elena's voice grew softer as she continued her night duties. "Life is strange that way, isn't it? Here I am taking care of you while your company is, in a way, determining the future of my family. Worlds that seem separate are actually connected." For hours after Elena had finished her confession and resumed her quiet duties, Max lay in the darkness, more awake than he had ever been. The face his company presented to the world, progressive, philanthropic, community-minded, suddenly seemed like a mask covering something uglier. Not evil, perhaps, but thoughtless, indifferent to the human cost of profit margins and property values. As dawn approached, Elena gathered her things to leave. "The day shift will be here soon," she said, her professional demeanor restored. "Try to rest well, Mr. Thornton. Despite everything, I do hope you recover soon. Everyone deserves a chance to wake up and see their world with fresh eyes." Long after she had gone, Max lay motionless, the weight of her words pressing on his chest more heavily than any medical condition. For the first time in decades, Maxwell Thornton felt truly seen, not as a wealthy man, a powerful developer, or a business icon, but simply as a human being connected to other human beings through invisible threads of consequence and care. And somewhere in the quiet morning hours, a plan began to form in his mind. The hospital took on a different atmosphere after Elena's revelation. Max found himself counting the hours until her night shifts, not just for the comfort of her presence, but because he needed to understand more about her, about his company, about the kind of man he had become. During the day, he paid closer attention to his visitors. Richard was coming less frequently now, often sending his assistant instead. When he did visit, his conversations revealed troubling patterns. The zoning commission is stalling on the river district. Richard complained to Patricia during one visit. They're asking about the environmental impact study that Max promised the neighborhood council. What environmental study? Patricia asked, sounding irritated. There isn't one. Richard lowered his voice. Max told them we'd do additional testing for groundwater contamination to get their support. It was just for show. We never intended to actually do it. Max felt a wave of shame wash over him. He remembered that meeting now. The concerned faces of the neighborhood representatives, his easy promises made with no intention of following through. At the time, it had seemed like a simple business tactic. Now lying helpless as others discussed his deceptions, it felt different. His son Thomas continued his regular visits, each one revealing more about the young man he'd never truly known. I brought you some music today, Thomas said one afternoon, setting up a small speaker. Remember how you used to play old jazz records on Sunday mornings? Mom always complained it was too loud, but you'd just turn it up and pull me into your study. The familiar notes of John Coltrane filled the room, and Max felt his heart tighten. Those Sundays had ended when the company expanded, when weekend work became the norm rather than the exception. He couldn't remember the last time he'd listened to music for pleasure. I teach a free art class on Sundays at the community center now, Thomas continued. Kids from the River District neighborhoods mostly. They're worried about being forced out when your development goes through. They've created some pretty powerful pieces about it. Thomas showed him photos of murals and sculptures created by his students, artwork that told stories of displacement and community resistance. In his previous life, Max would have dismissed these as naive obstacles to progress. Now forced into silence and reflection, he saw them differently, as human stories, not inconvenient roadblocks. But it was Elena's night shifts that truly became the center of Max's world. She continued caring for him with the same gentle efficiency, unaware that her words were reshaping his understanding of his own life. One particularly quiet night, Elena arrived looking troubled. She went through her usual routine before settling into the chair beside his bed. Something's been weighing on me, Mr. Thornton, she said after a long silence. I've never told anyone this, and here I am about to tell someone who probably can't even hear me. She laughed softly, nervously. Maybe that's why it feels safe. Max felt his consciousness sharpen, focused entirely on her voice. Before I became a nurse years ago, I worked at one of your companies, she began. I was just an administrative assistant in the accounting department at Thornton Urban Development. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it helped pay for my first year of nursing school. She paused, adjusting his blanket unnecessarily, a nervous gesture. 6 years ago, I noticed something strange in the files I was processing. Invoices for safety inspections that never happened, environmental certifications from companies that didn't exist, money flowing to consultants who seemed to do no actual consulting. Max knew instantly what project she was talking about. The West Side Commons, a mixed-use development that had been fast-tracked through approvals and constructed in record time. A project that had won awards for innovation and efficiency. I didn't know what to do, Elena continued. I was 24, a single mom with a baby, and desperately needed that job. But I couldn't ignore what I was seeing. People were going to live and work in those buildings. What if they weren't safe? She described gathering documents, making copies after hours, her growing certainty that something was deeply wrong. I took everything to my supervisor first. He told me I was misunderstanding, that everything was standard practice. When I insisted, he reminded me that questioning company practices wasn't part of my job description. Elena's voice grew quieter. So I made an anonymous report to the city inspector's office. I included copies of everything: the fake safety certificates, the non-existent environmental clearances, the questionable payments. I thought I was doing the right thing. What followed, she explained, was a minor scandal that had barely registered in Max's world, but had devastated dozens of lives, including Elena's. The city launched an investigation. Construction was halted. The project was delayed for months while inspectors combed through every aspect of the development. In the end, they found enough problems to require major corrections, but not enough to bring any serious charges against the company, Elena said. The official story became that there were procedural oversights that were promptly addressed once discovered. Max remembered the situation vaguely: an irritating delay, a financial hit that had been significant but not catastrophic. He'd been furious at the time, demanding to know who was responsible for the mistakes, never considering that they weren't mistakes at all but deliberate corners cut for profit. The project eventually went forward. Elena continued, but not before the company downsized the unnecessary staff in my department. 23 people lost their jobs, including me. Everyone knew the layoffs were connected to the investigation, even if it wasn't official. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. The hardest part wasn't losing my job. It was watching the news a year later when those buildings opened to such celebration. Your company was praised for addressing the safety concerns so thoroughly. You personally received an award for corporate responsibility. Max felt physically ill, remembering the glass trophy still displayed in his office, the speeches about integrity and community partnership he delivered with such confidence. I've questioned my decision every day since then, Elena said, turning back to face him. Those 23 people who lost their jobs, they had families, mortgages, children in college. Was exposing the truth worth the price they paid? The price I paid? She returned to his bedside, checking the monitors with professional detachment that contrasted with the emotion in her voice. You know what's strange? I'm not angry at you, Mr. Thornton. I was for a long time, but not anymore. I realize now you probably didn't even know what was happening. Big companies are like organisms where the left hand doesn't know what the right is doing. The people at the top are insulated from the daily compromises made in their name. Her words cut deeper than any accusation could have. The truth was both better and worse than she imagined. He hadn't known about this specific situation, but he had created the culture that made it possible. He had established the bonuses for coming in under budget, promoted the executives who got things done without asking how, looked the other way when questions arose about methods. Life takes such unexpected turns, Elena mused, her voice lightening slightly. If I hadn't lost that job, I might never have committed fully to nursing school. I might never have been assigned to care for you. Sometimes I wonder if anything is really random, or if we're all connected in ways we can't see until we look back. As the night deepened, Elena shared more of her story, how she'd struggled after losing her job, taking whatever work she could find while continuing her education, how her mother had moved in to help with Lily, creating both support and additional responsibility, how she still sometimes woke in a cold sweat, wondering if she'd done the right thing or simply been young and naive. The world isn't as simple as right and wrong, is it? She asked, not expecting an answer. Sometimes there's just choice and consequence, and hoping that when all is balanced, you've done more good than harm. Before leaving that morning, Elena did something she'd never done before. She gently took Max's hand in hers. I hope you can hear me somewhere in there, she said softly. I hope you. You know that despite everything, you're cared for here. Not because of your name or your money, but simply because you're human. That's what matters in the end, isn't it? Just our shared humanity. After she left, Max lay awake despite his exhaustion. Elena's story had forced him to confront truths he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. His company, his legacy, had been built on a foundation that included not just innovation and vision, but corner-cutting and intimidation. People had been hurt by decisions he'd made or allowed others to make in his name. For weeks, he'd been gathering information, learning truths about his life and business. Now he needed to decide what to do with that knowledge. The choice before him seemed impossible. Maintain his deception to learn more or end this charade and face the consequences of the life he'd built. As sunlight filled his room and the day shift arrived, Maxwell Thornton made his decision. His finger moved ever so slightly, a deliberate movement when the nurse checked his vitals. Not enough to be noticed this time, but a beginning, He would gradually wake up from his coma, but not as the same man who had entered it. The old Max had died somewhere in these quiet hospital nights. Whoever emerged would be shaped by the truths Elena had unknowingly revealed, about his company, about the impact of wealth and power, and about the possibility of redemption that came from simply being seen as human, nothing more and nothing less. The weight of Elena's confession pressed on Max's conscience throughout the following days. Each time a doctor checked his vitals or a nurse adjusted his position, he found himself thinking about the buildings his company had constructed. How many other corners had been cut? How many other whistleblowers had been silenced? The questions multiplied like shadows as evening approached. His decision to gradually wake up became more complicated as he overheard a conversation between Richard and Patricia outside his room. Their voices were hushed but tense, carrying clearly through the partially open door. "The board is getting impatient," Richard said. "We need to move forward with the River District property acquisitions before the city council changes hands next month." "And we will," Patricia replied firmly. "The power of attorney gives me signing authority on everything. The investors don't need to know the details of Max's condition." "And what if he wakes up?" Richard asked. "What if he realizes what we've done?" Patricia's laugh was cold. "The doctors say that's increasingly unlikely. Besides, by then it will be too late to undo anything." Max's blood ran cold. What exactly had they done that couldn't be undone? He'd suspected Patricia's faithfulness for years, but this sounded like something far beyond marital betrayal. Later that afternoon, his suspicions deepened when Thomas arrived with a legal folder tucked under his arm. Instead of his usual warm greeting, his son paced nervously before sitting beside the bed. "Dad, I don't know if you can hear me, but I found something you need to know about." Thomas's voice was strained. "I went to your home office to look for some family photos for the nurse. She thought familiar images might help. But I found these instead." He opened the folder, and although Max couldn't see its contents, his son's next words sent a chill through him. "These are papers for a completely restructured company. They're dated just 3 weeks before your stroke, but they have your signature, except it doesn't look like your signature, not exactly." Thomas leaned closer. "Ted, they've written you out of everything. The new structure puts Patricia and Richard in complete control, with your share reduced to a minority holding." Max's mind raced. He'd signed no such papers. The signature must be forged, a realization that turned his blood to ice. His own wife and business partner had planned to push him out, and were now using his medical condition to execute their plan without opposition. "I don't know what to do," Thomas continued, his voice breaking slightly. "The family lawyer won't speak with me because I'm not authorized. Patricia says these changes were your idea. Estate planning, she called it. But it doesn't make sense. You built this company from nothing. You wouldn't just give it away." For the first time, Max regretted his deception. If he revealed his consciousness now, he could stop whatever Patricia and Richard were planning. But another thought held him back. What if there was more to uncover? What if exposing them now only drove their schemes underground? When Elena arrived for her night shift, Max was lost in troubled thoughts. She noticed immediately. "Your heart rate's elevated tonight, Mr. Thornton," she said, checking the monitor. Sometimes that happens when patients are processing emotions, even in a coma state. Was today difficult? If only she knew. Max focused on relaxing, on steadying the betraying heartbeat that might reveal too much. Elena settled into her usual routine, her presence gradually calming him despite his inner turmoil. Tonight she brought a textbook on physical therapy techniques for coma patients. "I've been researching recovery strategies," she explained, demonstrating gentle movements with his unresistant limbs. "Simple exercises can help prevent muscle atrophy. I've asked the day staff to continue these, but they're often too busy." As she worked, moving his arms and legs through their range of motion, Max realized she was doing this on her own initiative, not because it was required, but because she cared. The contrast between her genuine concern and his wife's calculated betrayal couldn't have been sharper. Later, as Elena documented his vital signs, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and hesitated before answering. "Yes, this is Elena Mendez," she said, her voice professional but tense. "Yes, I understand the offer expires tomorrow." A pause. "No, I haven't made a decision yet. My family needs time to—" Another pause, longer this time. "I see. Thank you for the clarification. When she hung up, she sat heavily in the chair beside his bed, her usual composure cracking. That was about our apartment, she told him quietly. Thornton Urban Development, your company, is offering relocation assistance if we move out by the end of the month. After that, we're on our own. She rubbed her temples, fatigue evident in every line of her body. The new rent would take almost 80% of my income. Even with my mother's Social Security, we couldn't make it work. But finding a new place, coming up with first and last month's rent, security deposit, moving costs, it's impossible on such short notice. Max felt a surge of anger, not at Elena, but at himself. He had approved that acquisition strategy. Buy buildings in developing areas, raise rents to drive out existing tenants, renovate minimally, then market to a wealthier demographic. It was standard practice in the industry, clean, efficient, profitable. He had never considered the human cost of those displaced. They were abstractions, not real people with children named Lily who loved dinosaurs and tiny balcony gardens. You know what's ironic? Elena continued. I keep thinking about that report I made years ago. The investigation delayed the Westside Commons project, but it also forced the company to fix serious structural and safety issues before people moved in. When I pass those buildings now, I think, at least the families living there are safe. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. But I never considered what happened to the families who couldn't afford to live there after the renovations. They were displaced just like we're being displaced now. I stopped one kind of harm only to participate in another. The genuine distress in her voice struck Max deeply. Here was someone truly wrestling with the moral complexity of her actions, while he had spent decades making decisions that affected thousands without a second thought. His company's slogan, "Building Tomorrow's Communities," suddenly seemed hollow. What kind of communities was he really building? Ones that pushed out families like Elena's to make room for luxury condos and artisanal coffee shops? Elena's phone rang again. This time when she answered, her voice brightened. Hi, sweetheart. Yes, I'm at work, she listened, smiling. You did, that's wonderful. Put your drawing on the refrigerator and I'll look at it first thing when I get home. The transformation in her face as she spoke to her daughter was remarkable. Despite everything weighing on her, love shone through clearly. She lost her first tooth today, Elena explained after hanging up. She's convinced the tooth fairy will bring enough money to keep our apartment. Her smile faded. Children shouldn't have to worry about housing security, should they? But they pick up on everything, even when we try to shield them. Max thought about his own son Thomas, who had picked up on his father's disappointment and criticism just as clearly. He had failed as a father long before Patricia's betrayal, creating wounds that were only now beginning to heal through these one-sided hospital conversations. As the night progressed, Max made a decision. If his company was displacing families like Elena's, if Patricia and Richard were stealing his company through forged documents, if the River District project was proceeding based on false promises and environmental shortcuts, then waking up gradually wasn't enough. He needed to wake up now with a clear plan of action. But how? After weeks of pretending unconsciousness, a miraculous recovery would raise questions. The doctors might suspect psychological factors rather than physical ones. He needed a believable transition. As Elena checked his IV line around 3 a.m., Max allowed his finger to twitch slightly when she touched his hand. She paused, looking down. Mr. Thornton? She said tentatively. Did you just move your finger? He did it again, a small but unmistakable movement. Elena's eyes widened. That's it. That's wonderful, she encouraged, genuine excitement in her voice. Can you try again? Over the next hour, Max carefully progressed the finger movement, then a hand squeeze when asked. Finally, a slight fluttering of his eyelids that didn't quite open. Elena called the night doctor, who noted the changes with clinical interest but cautioned against over-optimism. Reflex movements are common in coma patients, he told Elena. Document everything, but let's wait until morning for the neurologist to evaluate. After the doctor left, Elena returned to Max's bedside, her eyes bright with hope. I don't care what he says. I think you're in there finding your way back. She took his hand gently. Take your time. Recovery isn't linear. Small steps forward, then rest, then try again. Her encouragement was genuine, her joy untainted by thoughts of power of attorney documents. or company restructuring. Max felt a tightness in his throat as he realized that among all the people in his life, this woman he barely knew was perhaps the only one who wanted him to recover, simply because she valued his humanity. In the quiet before dawn, as Elena continued her duties around the room, Max confronted the stark truth of his situation. His wife and business partner were betraying him. His company, his legacy, was built on practices that hurt people like Elena and her family. The fortune he'd amassed came at a cost he'd never acknowledged. The man he had been before the stroke would have responded with rage and retribution. That Max Thornton would have destroyed Patricia and Richard, using his considerable power to ensure they lost everything. He would have crushed any opposition to his developments, regardless of legitimate concerns. But that man had been lying in this bed for weeks, listening to the unfiltered truth about his life and legacy. That man had heard his son's pain and regret, witnessed his wife's cold calculation, and felt a nurse's compassion despite knowing the harm his company had caused her. That man was gone. Whoever would open his eyes tomorrow would be someone different, someone with the power to right past wrongs instead of perpetuating them. Someone who understood, finally, that a legacy wasn't measured in buildings constructed or profits earned, but in lives improved or diminished by one's choices. As morning light began filtering through the blinds, Max squeezed Elena's hand one more time. Tomorrow would bring doctors and tests, family notifications, and business implications. But tonight, in this quiet room with this extraordinary, ordinary woman, Maxwell Thornton began the journey back not just to consciousness, but to conscience. Morning brought a flurry of activity to Max's hospital room. The night doctor had logged Elena's observations, and by 7 a.m. a team of specialists hovered around his bed, their voices overlapping as they documented his responses. "Mr. Thornton, can you hear me? Squeeze my hand if you can hear me." Max responded with a weak but deliberate squeeze. The neurologist made notes while the others exchanged glances. "Pupillary responses improved," someone said. "BP and heart rate normal. Mr. Thornton, can you try to open your eyes?" This was the moment of truth. After weeks of deception, Max would finally reveal his consciousness. He allowed his eyelids to flutter, then slowly open. The bright hospital lights were blinding after so long in darkness. He blinked rapidly, a reaction that required no acting. "He's responding. Page Dr. Phillips and notify the family immediately." The next few hours passed in a blur of examinations, scans, and cautious optimism from the medical team. Max played his part carefully, a man gradually emerging from darkness, confused but increasingly present. He kept his responses minimal, a nod, a squeeze, occasionally a hoarse whisper that required them to lean close. By mid-morning, Patricia arrived, her carefully arranged expression of hope not quite reaching her eyes. "Max, darling, this is wonderful news," she exclaimed for the benefit of the medical staff, taking his hand in hers. When they stepped away to consult their charts, she leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Can you understand me? Do you know what's happening?" Max gave a slight nod, watching her face carefully. "Good," she said, patting his hand. "Don't worry about anything. I've been handling all the business matters. Everything is proceeding exactly as planned." He wondered which plan she meant, his company's legitimate projects or the scheme she and Richard had concocted. He allowed his expression to remain neutral, revealing nothing of his knowledge. The doctor returned, explaining that while Max's awakening was promising, recovery would be gradual. "Speech and motor functions may take time to fully return. We'll need to conduct extensive therapy and evaluations." This prognosis suited Max perfectly. It gave him the excuse to remain mostly silent, observing rather than explaining while he developed his strategy. Thomas arrived shortly after lunch, practically running into the room. Unlike Patricia's performance, his joy was genuine, his eyes filling with tears when Max recognized him with a weak smile. "Dad, you're really back," he said, gripping Max's hand tightly. "I knew you would be. I knew it." His son's authentic emotion pierced through Max's careful composure. This was what mattered. Not buildings or bank accounts, but the human connections he'd neglected for too long. He squeezed Thomas's hand in return, wishing he could express everything he'd realized during his silent weeks. The afternoon brought more visitors. Richard, visibly uncomfortable as he made awkward small talk, while avoiding any mention of business. Members of the board calling with congratulations. Doctors ordering additional tests to track his improving brain function. Through it all, Max maintained his facade of limited communication, a man capable of understanding but not yet able to fully respond. It gave him precious time to observe the reactions around him, particularly the tense exchanges between Patricia and Richard when they thought he wasn't watching. "This complicates everything," Richard muttered during one such moment. "How much do you think he knows?" "Nothing," Patricia replied firmly. "And by the time he's fully recovered, it will be too late to change course. Just stick to the plan." Max filed away every word, every nervous glance. His silent state had become a powerful tool, encouraging others to reveal their true intentions while he gathered information. As evening approached and the stream of visitors finally ended, Max found himself watching the door, waiting. When the night shift changed and Elena appeared, he felt an unexpected sense of relief. Here at least was one person whose motives he didn't question. She entered the room and stopped abruptly, surprise spreading across her face when she saw him awake and alert. "Mr. Thornton," she exclaimed, genuine pleasure in her voice. "They told me you had regained consciousness, but seeing it..." She moved to his bedside, checking his monitors with the familiar efficiency he'd observed for weeks. "This is wonderful. Truly wonderful." There was no calculation in her expression, no hidden agenda in her words, just authentic happiness for his recovery. For the first time that day, Max allowed himself a real smile. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. Elena looked startled to hear him speak. "You don't need to thank me. It's my job." Max shook his head slightly. "Not just a job. You talk to me, read to me." He paused, gathering strength. "Treated me like a person." Her eyes widened. "You could hear me? All this time?" He nodded slowly. Elena's face flushed. "Everything? Even when I..." She didn't finish the sentence, but he knew she was thinking of her confession about the whistleblowing, about her current housing crisis. "Everything," he confirmed quietly. She sank into the chair beside his bed, looking stricken. "I don't know what to say. I never thought..." "I would never have..." "I'm glad," Max interrupted, each word requiring effort but necessary. "Needed to hear the truth." Before she could respond, the door opened and Patricia returned, stopping short when she saw Elena. "Oh, you're here," she said dismissively. "I'll need some private time with my husband now." Elena rose professionally. "Of course, Mrs. Thornton, I'll be back to check his vitals in an hour." After she left, Patricia sat beside the bed, her expression shifting into something softer, more calculated. "The doctors say your speech should improve rapidly," she said, adjusting his pillows unnecessarily. "But you shouldn't strain yourself talking about complicated matters yet. Richard and I have everything under control." Max studied his wife's face, the woman he'd built a life with who now plotted behind his back. He'd married her 32 years ago, when his company was just beginning to succeed. Had she ever loved him, or only the security and status he provided? Had he ever truly loved her, or merely appreciated the polished, appropriate partner she presented to the world? "The documents," he said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "The ones you forged." Patricia's perfectly composed face froze. "What are you talking about?" "You're confused, darling. The stroke, Thomas found them," Max continued steadily. "My signature." "Not mine." Color drained from Patricia's face. "Max, you're not thinking clearly. Those documents were part of our estate planning. You signed them yourself." "No." The single word carried the weight of absolute certainty. Patricia's expression hardened, the pretense of loving concern vanishing completely. "You can't prove anything. Your memory would naturally be affected by your condition. No one would believe you." "Richard told you. What if he realizes what we've done?" Max quoted their overheard conversation with grim satisfaction.
"I heard everything." For a moment, Patricia seemed genuinely shaken.
Then her composure returned, ice replacing shock. "Fine. Yes, we restructured the company. You were becoming a liability, Max. The board was losing confidence. Your old-fashioned approaches, your reluctance to maximize certain opportunities, we were falling behind competitors. By not cutting enough corners?" Max asked, his voice strengthening with righteous anger. "By questioning the ethics of displacing families from their homes." Patricia laughed coldly. "Ethics don't build empires, Max. You used to understand that before you got soft." She stood, smoothing her immaculate suit. "This changes nothing. The documents are filed. The transactions are in motion. Even if you contest the signatures, the legal battles would take years and devastate the company's stock value. She moved toward the door, then paused. Rest and recover, Max. Then we can discuss a reasonable settlement that allows you a comfortable retirement while Richard and I move the company forward. Her smile didn't reach her eyes.
Think of it as early retirement.
You were always talking about having more time for yourself. After she left, Max lay in stunned silence. The betrayal, though suspected, still cut deeply when confirmed so coldly. His marriage, like much of his life, had been built on mutual benefit rather than love, a transaction masquerading as a relationship. Elena returned an hour later as promised, her manner more formal than before, clearly uncomfortable with the knowledge that he had heard her personal confessions. "Your vitals are good," she said professionally. "How are you feeling?" "Like someone who's been asleep too long," Max replied, each word coming easier than the last. "Elena, please sit." She hesitated before taking the chair beside him. "I owe you an apology," Max said carefully. Elena shook her head. "No, I'm the one who should apologize. I spoke inappropriately, shared personal opinions about you and your company that were unprofessional." "True opinions," Max corrected, "based on your experience." He took a deeper breath, gathering strength. "My company hurt you twice as a whistleblower. And now with your home?" Elena looked down at her hands. "You weren't responsible for those decisions personally. Large corporations, I was responsible," Max interrupted firmly. "My company, my culture, my priorities." He reached for the water cup on his bedside table, and Elena automatically helped him take a sip. The cool liquid soothed his throat, making speech easier. "Hearing you these past weeks made me see what I've become, what I've built." She remained silent, watching him with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. "I want to fix it," he said simply, "not just apologize." Fix it? How? It was a fair question, perhaps the only question that mattered. Max had spent his semi-conscious hours developing a plan, a way to address both the personal and professional betrayals he'd uncovered. "First, your building," he said. "The evictions stop. Today. Renovations will proceed, but current tenants can stay at their existing rent rates." Elena's eyes widened. "Can you really do that? Even from a hospital bed?" "Watch me," Max said, a hint of his old confidence returning. "And the River District project needs complete restructuring. Real environmental impact studies, affordable housing components, community input. Your partners won't like that," Elena observed carefully. Max's expression hardened. "My partners have bigger problems coming. Forgery, fraud, corporate conspiracy." "You'd destroy your own company to punish them?" Elena asked, concern in her voice. The question gave him pause. Would he? Once revenge would have been his only thought. Now, after weeks of forced reflection, he saw a different path. "Not destroy," he clarified. "Transform. The company has done harm. It can do better. Be better." He looked directly at Elena. "Your whistleblowing 6 years ago, you were right. The buildings were unsafe. You saved lives." Tears formed in Elena's eyes, the validation clearly touching something deep within her. "I've questioned that decision for years." "Don't," Max said firmly. "Courage deserves recognition, not punishment." They talked through the night, Max's voice growing stronger as dawn approached. He shared his plans for restructuring the company with a true ethical foundation. For using his wealth to address the housing crisis his own developments had worsened. For reconnecting with his son not as a disappointed father, but as a supportive one. As morning light filtered through the blinds, Elena checked her watch reluctantly. "My shift is ending. I should go." "Will you come back tonight?" Max asked. She hesitated. "Is that appropriate? Now that you're conscious, I mean." "I still need a night nurse," Max pointed out with a small smile. "And I need someone honest, who sees me as a person, not a portfolio." Elena nodded, returning his smile tentatively. "Then I'll see you tonight." After she left, Max reached for the phone beside his bed. His fingers, weak from weeks of disuse, fumbled slightly as he dialed. When the call connected, he spoke with quiet determination. "Thomas, it's Dad. I need your help with something important. Several things, actually." 6 months later, Max stood at the podium of a community center in the River District, facing a room full of residents, reporters, and city officials. Behind him, a large display showed the revised development plans. Less dense, more green space with 40% of units designated affordable housing. This isn't charity, he explained to the skeptical audience. It's responsibility. For too long, development has meant displacement. Today, we're showing a different model, one where growth lifts existing communities rather than replacing them. The journey hadn't been easy. Patricia and Richard had fought back fiercely when confronted with evidence of their fraud. The legal battles were still ongoing, but with Thomas's help in gathering evidence and the support of board members alarmed by the conspiracy, Max had reclaimed control of his company. He had divorced Patricia, a process that revealed the full extent of her deception, including a long-running affair with Richard and systematic embezzlement from company accounts. The tabloids had feasted on the scandal, but Max found he cared little for public opinion. His focus remained on rebuilding not just his company, but his understanding of what success truly meant. After the presentation, as attendees mingled over refreshments, Max spotted Elena at the back of the room. She no longer worked as his nurse. That would have been inappropriate given their evolving relationship, but had taken a position at a community health clinic he had funded. She was completing her advanced nursing certification, supported by a scholarship program Max had established for healthcare workers pursuing additional education. "What did you think?" he asked as he approached her. "Impressive," she replied with the candor he'd come to value, "but the real test comes with implementation. Will the board support these initiatives long-term?" "They'll have to," Max said confidently. "The new corporate charter makes social responsibility a legal obligation, not just a marketing slogan." Elena smiled, that warm expression that had been his lifeline during dark hospital nights. "I'm proud of you, Max. Not many people get a second chance and use it this well." From across the room, Thomas waved, indicating a group of community representatives waiting to speak with Max. "Duty calls," Max said reluctantly. Elena nodded understanding. "Go. Change the world one building at a time." As he walked away, Max reflected on the strange path that had brought him here. A stroke, a deception, a nurse's honest words, all combining to wake him from a spiritual coma far deeper than his physical one had been. He had lost his marriage, several fair-weather friends, and the unquestioning trust of business associates, but he had gained something far more valuable: clarity about what truly mattered, reconnection with his son, and the chance to reshape his legacy from one of exploitation to one of positive impact. Most precious of all was the growing relationship with Elena. Not romance yet, though perhaps someday, but something equally valuable. Honest friendship based on mutual respect and shared values. Max approached the waiting community representatives, extending his hand in greeting. Once he would have sent an assistant to handle such a meeting, seeing it as beneath his level. Now he understood that these conversations with real people affected by his decisions were the most important work he could do. "Thank you for coming," he said sincerely. "I'm here to listen and learn." The words felt unfamiliar on his tongue but right in his heart. Maxwell Thornton, who had once believed himself awake while sleepwalking through life, had finally truly opened his eyes, not just to the world around him, but to the person he could choose to be within it. And for that awakening, he had a pretend coma and an honest nurse to thank.